25%, 50%, 75% tip. That's a lot.
Tipping has become a burden. 25, 50, 75% tips for a takeout order or Starbucks coffee. And don't even get me started on food delivery apps. If you're ordering something small, be prepared to leave a tip.
I do think food delivery apps should be much more transparent with how much you're paying before you actually place your order. Because I think there's just so many hidden costs and extra fees. It's like you can place an order for $24 and it's $46. It's nuts.
That's worth more than your order itself. And it's not just restaurants where you'll be tipping either. Nowadays, tipping is commonplace at barbershops, car washes, Ubers, plumbers, and basically any other service.
I don't think this is true. My understanding is that tipping in a barbershop has always been the norm. Tipping anybody that's doing any sort of trade skill has never been the norm. Yeah, like I remember like my dad would tip our barber like whenever he and I would go and get our haircut like 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if people are ever tipping like for example, we have a guy, he's like a kind of like a family friend, and he does a lot of like electrician work for us and other stuff like that. And like, he always doesn't ask for that much money, and I always end up giving him more money. I'm like, he's like, oh, you know, give me like 180, I'll give him 200, right? But like, that's because I know I'm getting a bro deal because he's saying that in the first place. So like, it's a totally different dynamic
that you can think of, which doesn't really make sense. At least with restaurants, the service is not the main thing you're paying for.
Yeah.
You're paying for the food.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense to appreciate great service that came along with it. But in the case of a car wash or a haircut, you're paying for the service itself. So it's kind of odd that you have to pay 15 or 25% more. And inflation has only made this worse. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that these people shouldn't be paid a fair wage, but rather that it should be reflected in the upfront price. This would not...
I'm glad to see more people calling out tipping and how corrosive it is. I personally don't think that the customer, like, I think there should be, and this is what I said about the first video, and I know there are people that disliked what I said, but I really believe this. I find it to be ridiculous that people think that we should solve this with, like, legislation. Why can't you just not give them the money? Because the person has the option to not tip. So why is it that so the government has to mandate because you don't have self-control because you're too afraid of looking bad? That's so weird, bro. Like, it's so fucking weird. Yeah, it's just, I hate that, man. Not tipping. Yeah, I don't tip all the time. Businesses, I can explain this one. Yeah, can I please get one reason why it has to be a fucking a law? Just don't give them the money. Like, I don't get this. Just don't give them the money. Like, what's the problem? Businesses really taking advantage of employees. Waiters get below minimum wage and filled up by tipping. Let me rephrase that. I think that if you want to tip, that's totally fine. And tipping in some cases makes sense. Now, I do think there should be legislation that makes it to where everybody who is a person who's paid through tips, I don't think that this should be calculated. Like, every single person should have to be paid a minimum wage and a living wage. I don't like the idea that this is offset by customers being guilted into it. So yeah, I'm not saying that at all. I'm only saying that as an individual, I don't like the idea that if somebody asks for money, that you need the government to tell them no for you. I find this to be massively ridiculous. This is super ridiculous. And I'm not saying at all that people should be paid only by tips. Yes, I mean, there are restaurants all over the world, and those waiters are not being paid with tips. That's totally fine. We don't need tips for restaurants to exist, obviously, because the U.S. is not the only place that has restaurants. So I totally feel that way. However, I do find it to be very odd that people have such... I think the reason why is that there's like a massive like social stigma on not tipping. you're seen as like stingy or greedy or shitty or something like that, like a bad person for not tipping. And I think people are so afraid of that negative social outcome that they're willing to like do something that's financially bad for them, which I find to be absolutely fucking pathetic. It is absolutely fucking pathetic that somebody is more concerned with what people they don't care about, what they think about them, versus what they're going to do with their own money. And that is what I think is problematic, because I don't think in any way the government should try to regulate that. That's pathetic. If somebody wants to ask for a 100% tip, tell them fucking no. You are a grown-ass adult. Learn to say no. Again, I think that tips should 100% not be calculated into somebody's wages. I think it's crazy. Everybody should be paid a minimum wage, a living wage, whatever you want to call it. There should not be anybody getting paid $2 an hour because they can get tips too. I just wanted to make sure that was very clear. Because I know some people, like there's nuances with that. People might not understand where I'm coming from. Hopefully you guys see what I'm saying now.
Only make it easier for customers to gauge just how much they're spending for a service, but it also makes the income of the service worker much more stable. In fact, this is how it's done in most places outside of the United States and Canada.
I also, now that I think about it more, because somebody mentioned something about a restaurant and how they're going to fuck with your food, I do think it could be fair to mandate that a user, like you can't ask for a tip until after you provide service. Because I do think that it's like super hyper toxic that like you know how much you're getting tipped before you give service. And like there's all these memes of like Uber drivers and shit like that putting people's hot food next to the AC if they're not tipping them, right? This is extremely toxic and it's bad for the user. And it just creates a bad environment and there's no positive to it. So I do think that it could be fair for some sort of legislation to say that you can't ask for a tip before you receive service. Or, you know, until after you provided service, something like that.
Countries like France, Denmark, and much of Europe, a standard service fee of 15% is applied to all bills. So there's no awkward situation where you have to select 15, 25, 35%, or no tip as the cashiers watch you. But even this is not ideal.
Yeah, I just, again, like that awkward situation, it's not awkward to me because it's just not really a big deal. Like, just don't feel awkward. Stop being peer pressured by a capitalist society. Be your own man. It's that simple.
Ideally,
just say no.
The price of the service is just included in the product itself, as is the case in Japan, China, and South Korea. In fact, in many of these countries, tipping is actually considered rude and disrespectful.
Yeah, like you need the money.
The reason being that if you're tipping, you're basically insinuating that the business does not pay them enough, which is unfortunately often the case in America.
That's actually true.
In fact, the minimum wage for service workers is only $2.13 per hour in America. But how did things get so bad? How did tipping go from being something that we used to appreciate exceptional service to being a burden for customers and a necessity for employees?
I think one of the big reasons why it happened, like personally, I think the reason why it happens nowadays is because it's a way for people to express wealth. So like people get to show that they have a lot of money by being able to tip. So then it gives them a way to shame other people for having less money that simultaneously doesn't make them look like assholes. So it gives the upper class and people that are more affluent a way to look down on lower class people. I think that's number one. And number two is because the waiters and everybody, I think, has a general understanding that waiters need tips in order to make money. So it's seen differently because they're not receiving a full wage. Like, for example, how many of you guys, one of the decisions in your mind, whether you should tip or not, is whether this person is working at a restaurant that is a service restaurant that they're being paid $2 or they're getting paid an actual living wage? Because, like, for me, if I know somebody is a waiter, I would be more likely to tip them than if I know they were just an employee receiving $15 an hour. You see what I'm saying? You don't tip, sorry. Job doesn't pay me to drive 7 miles for to drop off your $3 at McDonald's. Well, I understand that. And again, you don't have to drive 3 miles to drop off their McDonald's. You have chosen to engage in this. This is not like nobody, kidnapped you and made you be an Uber driver. This is your job. You chose to take this job. And if you are unhappy with the payment from the job, quit the fucking job or take it up with your employer, not the people that you're serving, because your employer should be responsible for paying you. That's why they're your employer. That's between you and them, not the fucking customer. The customer's paying the company. They're not paying you. It's going to Uber, not Billy.
Taking a look back, tipping wasn't always a custom in the United States, but it has been this way for quite some time, as American tipping dates back to the mid-1800s. You may have heard that tip stands for to ensure promptness, but that's just a myth. In reality, tipping was something that wealthy Americans discovered when traveling to Europe. You see, tipping was a master-servant custom that was invented in Europe during the Middle Ages. Masters would reward servants with extra cash for excellent service.
There you go.
As these Americans saw this practice, they latched onto it and they brought it back to the US. Being able to pay extra for a service really showcased their status and wealth, which many of their egos could not resist.
And that's what it is, bro. Like, there's nothing that disgusts me more than upper middle class people that look down on lower working class people for not being able to tip. Like, I find that to just be the pinnacle of just absolute, like, it's just vile behavior. It's so disgusting. I hate them.
Tipping didn't catch on in America that easily. In fact, there was a lot of resistance to tipping. For one, people felt that tipping culture was simply reinforcing social constructs and classism. The upper class was literally flexing their wealth on lower class citizens.
Yep.
But that wasn't the only concern. The other concern was that tipping was only viable for the rich. Eating out was expensive as it is, so expecting middle class and lower class people to offer tips on top of the bill seemed un-American. In fact,
it is.
This ideology became so prevalent in America that it actually spread to Europe, and that's why tipping is not standard in European countries. But America would completely U-turn on this idea after the Civil War. While slaves were finally freed, their job prospects weren't all that great. And
I love how the foundation of tipping is built off of slavery and racism. As if that doesn't give you a pretty good indicator of, is this a good thing or not? Yeah. So like this thing we started doing with like slaves? Oh, okay. I'm sure we're on the right moral fucking track now, right guys? Holy fuck.
Most of them would end up in service-related industries. And these industries figured that this was the perfect opportunity to capitalize on tipping. You see, these industries figured that they could get away with paying former slaves no money.
Yep.
Technically, they weren't enslaving these people as they could earn money through tips. Also, they could theoretically leave at any time, but really, it's not like they had anywhere else to go to. So, service industries became filled with former slaves that became dependent on tips for income.
Yep. Again, a really great moral foundation for tipping. Well, back whenever we had slaves, you see, they made them work for no money. And nowadays, like,
Suddenly,
Jesus.
Tipping was no longer a way to flex your wealth. It became much more of a moral issue. If you didn't tip, you were inadvertently supporting slavery.
There you go.
Now, of course, you could argue that if you buy chocolate or something, you're supporting child labor in some third world country.
You are.
But it's much harder to accept that when you're face to face with a person.
Yeah.
Essentially, people who were against slavery started feeling obliged to tip, regardless of their own financial position.
Yeah, you hate
And with
slavery,
that,
right, bro?
Tipping started becoming
Bro, you don't
a
like
burden.
slavery, do you? Bro, were you a slavery enjoyer?
While tipping was rapidly gaining popularity throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, this isn't to say that everyone was happy with the practice. In fact, a large portion of the population was not happy with the practice.
Nobody would like tipping. Why would anybody like the idea of having to pay more money for something? Like, of course, nobody would like it. Nobody likes this, except for people that are making money from tips.
and we would see some resistance even from local governments. Georgia, for example, deemed that tips were essentially commercial bribes used to influence service. So naturally, paying bribes should not be customary or encouraged.
Yeah.
But the issue was that much of the pushback from these governments were classic in their own ways. For example, in 1915, 6 states would abolish the practice of tipping. This seems like a reasonable move. The policy that should have been introduced to enforce this rule would have been some sort of minimum wage. This way, service workers would no longer be dependent on tips. But instead of punishing businesses for paying $0 incomes, these governments would decide to punish service workers. Iowa, for example, ruled that those who accepted a gratuity of any kind, not those who gave the money themselves, could be fined or imprisoned.
Bro, what is going on in the government, man? What? How do they do that? What the hell? What is wrong with them?
Fortunately, Supreme Courts would step in and deem these rules unconstitutional.
Thank you.
But they never proposed a better solution, meaning that things just returned to how they were. In fact, they actually became worse due to a series of laws passed by Congress, starting with the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This legislation introduced a federal minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and banned child labor, which sounds great. But the pitfall of this act was that it specifically excluded tipped workers. Congress would simply double down on this stance in 1966 with their so-called tip credit. Essentially, restaurants were legally allowed to pay a sub-minimum wage as long as...
Bro, like... How does anybody watch this and not think that it's rigged? Like, it's crazy. Like... How do you not think it's rigged? What the fuck?
Tips pushed workers over the minimum wage threshold. At least restaurants were required to pay a percentage of the minimum wage, usually somewhere between 40 and 60%. But this too would change with time. In 1996, Congress ruled that restaurants only had to pay tipped workers a minimum of $2.13 per hour, and that's still how it is across much of the US. You would think that with all these anti-service worker policies that people would rise up and protest these changes, but the exact opposite actually happened.
No, of course not, because it gives people, the thing is, everybody always wants a way to look down on other people. And if you give people that tool, they will enjoy it a lot. That's the reason why people buy expensive cars, they buy expensive clothes, they buy expensive everything. It's because everybody wants to be conspicuous with spending their money. So it gives them a way to look down on poor people that's socially accepted. And there is no better thing in the world to be able to shit on somebody and think that you're morally justified or you're ethically justified for doing it. Like, that is the pinnacle, bro. It's like jerking off. Where, like, you can shit on somebody and treat somebody like fucking garbage, and it's okay because you're morally superior. That's what they love.
The demographics of service industries were rapidly changing. It was no longer a bunch of former slaves. In fact, over 50% of all waiters are now white people. But it wasn't just the public that was okay with the tipping either. Many service workers actually preferred the tipping model. You see, it wasn't just the race of service workers that was changing. It was also the age.
Well, you're going to, of course, have more service workers that prefer the tipping model because it's a survivorship bias. All of the people who don't prefer the tipping model aren't servers. So if you poll servers, all of them would probably be more likely to like it, or they wouldn't be servers. It's just, there it is.
Nowadays, service industries are filled with a bunch of high school students and young adults. In fact, nearly 50% of all waiters are between the age of 20 and 30. For these people, doing service work is often a part-time thing, so stability isn't necessarily the top concern.
Well, it's also that if you're younger, the odds are that you're more attractive. And if you're more attractive, the odds are you're going to get more tips. So it would make sense that more young people are into being servers because that, you follow the logic. That will, on average, give them more tips. There it is. Makes sense. Yes, it just makes sense. Bigger tits, bigger tips. Definitely.
That they're much more willing to take a gamble. Instead of taking a set minimum wage, they're willing to bet on the generosity of people during a Friday night or Independence Day weekend. Statistically speaking, you're much better off with a minimum wage, but this hasn't exactly changed the minds of service workers. Tipping was no longer about appreciation or fighting slavery. Tipping was now about maximizing revenue for service industries and service workers, leading us to where we are today. It turns out that there's a whole science behind the psychology of tipping, and there's dozens of research articles about how to maximize tips. These studies—
Oh, it's easy. If you want to know, like, listen, I could do a 3-hour video about how to farm donations on Twitch. Like, I am so good at this. Like, bro, me and McConnell had this down. Bro, this shit was a science. Like, it was a fucking, like, you go from, you got a bullet point list with, like, numbers, letters, lowercase letters. Bro, everything was in there. You had, like, okay, how to respond in certain ways. Oh, man, it was no problem on how to do this. If you think that it's all just some random mumbo-jumbo shit, there are tried and true ways to farm donations. Oh, it's not even the Twitch Prime thing. To be honest, the Twitch Prime was whenever we started getting lazy. Yeah, we started getting lazy at that point. It's like, Twitch Prime, yeah, whatever, right? But, like, you gotta go deeper than that.
Found that waiters should introduce themselves, repeat customer orders, give compliments, call customers by their name, etc. But those are all small fish items. The factor that has really propagated modern tipping culture is none other than technology. The reality—
Well, I think also a lot of people tipped during the pandemic because they're like, well, if you're willing to die for my sandwich, I can at least give you $1, right? I think that's kind of reasonable. Like, sure. So I think that's why people were willing to tip back in the day.
Is that technology makes it so easy to spend money and has removed so much of the pain that is naturally associated with spending money that we're simply way more willing to spend money. Take cards, for example. Consumers are willing to spend up to 83% more when paying with a card as a—
Bro, thank you, bro. Because I have been saying this shit for years. I am so glad now I have a number. Yep, there you go. I told you this. If you want to save money, go to the fucking ATM, go to the bank, take the money out of your fucking card account, and then pay for shit with cash. And I don't know about you guys. I'm sure there are people that are part of that 73% or 17%, maybe that are different. That's not really how the math works with that, but let's just say it does. I'm sure there are people that spend more cash than whenever they're on their card, right? Different psychology. But I think with a lot of people, like, seeing the fucking money, you see the money, and it's like, okay, this is why I bought these. I bought these because it's like whenever we're talking about playing Lost Ark, how does it feel every time that I do a 10 pull in Honkai Impact, Honkai Star Rail, and I tear one of these fuckers in half? It's a whole different vibe than whenever you just see some crystals disappear. Because you know what this is. This is a fucking 20. This is a meal anywhere, and this shit just went in the goddamn garbage. So yeah, it's an investment though. Oh yeah, true. Let's see here. It's not legal to destroy currency. It depends on what the currency is. So, for example, if it's currency, it would be illegal, but if it's not currency, it's not illegal. Yeah. So does that make sense? Anyway, point is that if you're trying to save money, buy things with cash. Every single time that I am somewhere and I'm buying something with cash, I am always less likely to spend money because I can see the value of the money going away.
To cash. So I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that the average cash purchase is only $22 while the average card purchase is $112.
That's probably an average, right? It's like you're averaging like bill payments and stuff like that. I find that to be like I actually I don't really like that statistic. I find that to be a misleading and like not very great statistic because a lot of people have like automatic payments on cards, whereas whenever they're buying things with cash, they're paying for smaller ticket items, like for example, like buying something at a convenience store, etc. So you have like there's a reason why card purchases would be higher. Yeah, it's a bad data point.
$12. But by far the biggest culprit when it comes to excessive tipping is the infamous iPad payment terminals. For starters,
yeah,
you're
we
paying
have
with
these
a
all
card
over the place
as
in
opposed to
Austin.
cash, so that's already working against you. But there are several other factors that push you to tip. For example, you don't have to go through the hassle of calculating a tip. You can simply select a percentage and the iPad will do the math. Another technique that these terminals employ is suggesting a super high minimum tip. This terminal, for example, is suggesting a minimum tip of 18%. Of course, you could skip the tip, but what if you felt that the service actually deserved a 5 or 10% tip? You can either type in the tip manually,
18%.
which would just prolong the awkwardness, or you can just select 18. Speaking of awkwardness, this is likely the most effective method when it comes to guilting customers into tipping. And
I think also the problem is the implication, like everybody's seen Waiting, right? So it's the implication that if you don't tip, you're going to get bad service. I do think that it is unhealthy that people are expected to tip before they receive service. This is just, it's very, very bad. And I do think that there is no reason that it should be like that, and it is harmful to the customer.
the source of most people's frustrations. Traditionally, any and all tips are left on the table, and waiters don't see the amount until after the customer leaves. This allows customers to be honest about how good the service actually was. But when you're forced to select a tip amount at the register, you know that the cashier is going to see what you select. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that everyone behind you is also going to see what you select, and you—
This is just, bro, like, I am so sick. I'm sorry. I am so sick of these pussies, bro. Absolute fucking pussies. It's your goddamn fucking money. Who gives a fuck what some moron behind you thinks? This guy gives a fuck. He's an NPC. Who cares? Why do you? What the fuck's wrong with you? What does this even matter? Pathetic.
You don't want to be that one person that skips the tip. Service industries have figured out how to brilliantly leverage technology and peer pressure you into maximizing tips.
Yeah.
While this is a smart move for them, this has simply left customers exhausted and frustrated with modern tipping.
The
Hearing all this,
anti-tipping
I
movement.
don't think that you'd be surprised to hear that there's a strong and a growing movement against tipping. These people argue that tipping has nothing to do with showing appreciation and everything to do with the fact that many service workers aren't paid fairly to begin with. I mean, it's
Yeah, I
not
think that's
like
the way
you
a lot
tip
of people
service
see it.
workers who are paid well. For example, when was the last time you tipped your pilot, or your lawyer, or your accountant, or your doctor? These people provide way more valuable services
Yeah,
than a
it's guilt tripping, definitely. Guilt tipping. There you go.
waiter or a hotel housekeeper, yet you don't tip them. If anything, you might send them a thank you note or buy them chocolate. Why? Well, probably because you know that they're already paid well, which supports the idea that the only reason you tip—
Yeah, I think that's, again, it's a big reason why people tip is that they know these servers don't make any fucking money. If everybody knew that they were making a good wage, I think that tipping would go down tremendously. And, like, the social pressure of it would completely, like, it would go down, like, 80%. It would get massively nerfed.
some service workers is because you know they're paid poorly, not actually because you appreciate their service. So theoretically, if we paid service workers better wages, we can eliminate tipping culture in America. Pro tippers don't agree. They feel that eliminating tipping will simply give businesses more opportunity to gouge prices. For example, a $21 meal may rise to $24. Also,
I really hate the logic, and people use this logic with other things too, like employing like migrant workers and stuff like that. I really hate the logic that the reason why we should keep people in unhealthy, bad jobs that are paying them badly is because if we don't, things will cost more. This is, you're basically saying we have to pay these people slave wages, or if we don't, then things will cost too much. If you can't make a good product by paying a living wage, maybe you don't deserve to be in business. I don't know. Maybe I'm just.
This isn't all that favorable for takeout customers, as they will also have to pay the higher prices. But with that being said, it looks like the rest of the world has made this work. So maybe there's something.
Yeah, it's like it's impossible. Like, bro, how can anybody do this? Like, we're the only place in the world that has restaurants.
Do it, but only time will tell. Are you team anti-tip or team pro-tip? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you think tipping has gone way too far. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community, suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
There it is. I think this is actually a really good video. I like it. Yeah, definitely. Customers shouldn't subsidize employees' wages through tips. I completely agree with you. I think tipping as a practice is completely toxic. However, I do think people should exercise their own personal self-control in deciding whether they want to tip or not. There is no reason why you have to tip. You should never have to tip. You can tip if you want to. Never, ever, 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 ever feel compelled to tip, guys. Listen, if they don't ask you for the money up front, if it's not part of the initial cost whenever you agreed to it, then you should not be expected to pay anything else besides that. And listen, people say, oh, well, if you can't tip, you can't afford to eat out. Okay. Well, if you can't afford to not get tips, maybe you shouldn't be able to have the job. How about that? That's what I think. Don't put it on the menu. Don't charge that price if you don't want people to pay it. Too fucking bad. Could, in theory, have tipping allow people with less money to go out more often, but just shame people for doing that? Yeah. Let's see here. As a foreigner, I don't tip in the U.S. because a $5 tip is the price of a full meal in my country. Oh, I don't know. I mean, here's... Like, I will tip people money nowadays because, I can, it's not a big deal for me, right? I don't care. And, I get my money primarily through tips, or I used to at least. Now I can get it through, sponsorships and, ads and stuff like that. But, whenever I was a streamer, it was much easier to just, get money through tips. Exactly. Tipping culture isn't really a thing in the UK. Oh, yeah, definitely. I know it's not. You have to pay for every refill outside the U.S., and for ketchup packets at McDonald's, they also pay to use the bathrooms. Well, I don't know how they do it over there, but McDonald's doesn't get tips here, so I don't really see the comparison. What happens if you don't tip? You'll be worried if you go back to the place? Well, if I get bad service whenever I go back to the place, then I stop going there. It's that simple. Fuck. What do you... Well, yeah, if I go somewhere and I get bad food, I just... Yeah. Tipping's on the rise in Europe and other westernized Asian countries, so I don't know about over there, but I know about over here. I used to never tip, and any time that they made me tip, I would steal silverware and different things from the restaurant to make up the money from having to tip. I would do this all the time. And obviously, after a while, I stopped doing that whenever I got a bit older, but, that was my outlook on it all the time. Yeah, tipping must be a spontaneous act, not mandatory. You can fight the tipping culture war, but unfortunately you're just hurting those working in service positions. I don't agree with that. I don't like the idea that you as the customer exercising your own discretion with your own money, you are hurting somebody. You know who's hurting the people in the service industry? The government and the employers. They're the ones that are hurting them. You're not hurting them. That's not your problem. That's not your responsibility. You fight by voting and protesting unions. You should do both, right? I mean, this is my thing is that it's the same thing with streaming. There are people that have watched my content for 10 years. I mean, about 10 years. It hasn't been 10 years, but it's been a long time, right? Better part of 10 years. And they've watched it with ad block on the entire time. They've never subbed, never donated, neighbor's Wi-Fi, stolen internet, stolen laptop, and they've never spent a single cent. And you know what? I still made money off of you. Because the odds are you probably saw some advertisement that I had. I was able to utilize your viewership in negotiating a sponsor. I still made money off of you. So really, this is a problem with these restaurants not being able to create a sustainable business model. And if you can't make a sustainable business model and pay people a livable wage or minimum wage, whichever one, I don't really care which one it is. That's a debate for in itself. If you can't pay people what is legally required for everybody else to get paid, you don't deserve to be in business. That's what I think. You don't deserve to be in business. It's too bad. Places like McDonald's can pay minimum wage, so why not other restaurants? Because they can rely on like fucking these like middle class people that think they're rich, guilt tripping lower class people to give their money away in tips. That's why. I'll link you guys the video again. Easy to say, but how would you want to change it? Well, here's how I would change tipping, okay? That, like, if I was God, this is what I would do. Or I was the government, whatever you want to call it. I would make it to where you can't ask for a tip until after service has been provided. And I would also, I think actually, I would make it to where every single person has to be paid the same minimum wage. I would get rid of the idea that some people have to be paid subsidized through tips. Like, those two things I would do. Everything else I wouldn't do. I would still allow people to ask for tips. I would still allow people to try to guilt customers into tipping, because I think that is it is an unhealthy relationship, but I think that the business has a right to ask. I think it's fair. However, I do think that, like, the customer can express their own will without fear of retaliation, as long as they've already received the service. You already tip after service in restaurants, though? Well, we're talking about things like, so whenever I was talking about that, I'm not talking about restaurants. I'm talking about things like Uber and things like Uber Eats, like DoorDash. And there are many places where you actually have to tip before you receive service. Why would someone ask for tips? You give a tip if you want to? Well, because it's money. Japan doesn't enable tipping culture. Well, good for them. People think people being served minimum wage with how people behave. Nobody's going to willingly be a doormat for people for $7 even. Yeah, they will. Look at McDonald's. Of course they will, because they need $7. Like, that's just the truth. Like, somebody says, oh, well, you know, I won't do this for this much money. Okay, so then you're just going to die? No, you're going to do it for $7. Well, I mean, fuck. What else is there to say? Rent isn't free. Yeah, like, it's a sad world, but there it is. What happens in a restaurant if you don't tip? I don't know. I get my food, I eat, and then I leave. Who cares what happens to the restaurant? That's not my problem. Yeah, like, who cares?